Are you booting? Now duplicating ledge. Let's just show the first one. Are you using it? I will use it. Anyway. Now let's start. Oh. It's okay? But we don't see the what's that? Some part is missing. You can close it with it. Still missing. Is this an issue with your computer or with the email? I don't know. So it's an issue with your computer. Anyway. You can preparing to stop here. Okay, anyway, you need to stop. You're wrong here. So let's get started. This is the Netconf working group session. We have a full agenda. We are actually, in reality, lacking 5 minutes, from which we used already a few. Mahesh prepared the working group status slides. I would like to suggest to keep it short and just look at the agenda. The status slides can be seen on the proceeding page. We would like to have an additional note taker. We have already one. Just to be sure, we need a second note taker. Can anybody take notes, please? Yeah. Is there any volunteer to take notes? You just need to write down the essential part. No need to write he said, she said, he said. Please. Everyone is looking away. So we are stuck here. We are not going to proceed. If you are able to help, please help now. Okay, we will continue with Lada. Lada is the note taker. I assume this will be sufficient. We have a Jabbar scribe. Please stand up and read the questions coming in. So please take care of note well. Everything you are saying here is a contribution to IETF and has to be seen under the IPR policy of IETF. Please read the rest, which I am not reading right now, and take care of it. So this is the agenda. Please, Mahesh, just summarize what we are going to have as discussion.
All right. So on the agenda, under the chartered items, we have 4 presentations from Andy, starting with RESTconf, Yang Patch, Yang Module, and the RESTconf collection resource. And that will be followed by Kent. He has 3 of them. Netconf Call Home, Server Configuration, and Zero Touch. Under the non-chartered items, we have a discussion from the I2RS chairs on the work that they've been doing to present the requirements to Netconf from at least an I2RS perspective. And that will be followed by Eric Voigt talking about requirements for subscription to Yang data stores, followed by Alex Clem on subscribing to data store push updates. And then we have Bing, who's going to talk about a combination of 2 drafts that he merged recently, and he's titled it Data Fragmentation. Finally, the chairs will be presenting the time capability Netconf. This was a draft presented, I believe, in 87 IETF. And the authors have asked it to be represented to see if they could get some support in the working group. So status, 5939 BIS is an ISG evaluation. We have adopted the Yang library and RESTconf connection resource that Andy is going to present as work group items. And the charter, of course, has been updated accordingly. We had 3 meetings between 91 and 92 to work on some of the work group drafts. We did make some progress, and we have started the last call on RESTconf and Yang patch. Now, RESTconf, being a major protocol, has had maybe 1 review. So we do need it to be reviewed before we feel that we can progress that draft to last call. So please do take the time to go through the RESTconf protocol draft. We also executed last call on call home and server model, and I believe Kent is working on some of the comments that he has received.
So I would say let's stop here and go to the first agenda item, which is RESTconf by Andy Bierman. So, Andy, you have now all of your presentations as a package. You get.
So you haven't.
Yeah, I mean, we will go one by one, but they are together. So, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to go over the RESTconf draft fairly quickly and try to get to the open issues. So, next slide. Here's a highlight of the issues that were resolved and put into draft 04. I'm not going to go through them. If you want to go through all the details, they're on GitHub. Next slide. More issues that were already resolved. Next slide. So the new issues that are verified that I brought up on the list have to do with any XML. And Kent was the only one who commented and I guess agreed with the proposals. When you're dealing with any XML, it's a terminal node, although it's not really always used that way. But for purposes within RESTconf, any XML will be a terminal node, meaning that there are no sub-resources within an any XML node. It cannot be addressed in a target resource URL, and they're not part of the data model, any subnodes within an any XML. The second one, number 18, is a little more problematic. I think I've been looking at this in our code, and you actually have to go out of your way to treat any XML as just one depth level. So I would say that one, number 18, should be changed to a server may treat any XML is one depth level, and depending on how it's implemented in the server, it might be something else. But any XML isn't interoperable, so you shouldn't expect any interoperability from it. So, and the third one was the fields parameter cannot specify any subnodes of any XML because they're not in the schema. Only nodes that are in the schema can be in that fields parameter. So, except for number 18, which I'd like to relax and make it a may instead of a must, those changes will be made in the next draft. Any questions, comments on that? Okay, next slide. So, we are keep. Oh, Jürgen.
Yeah, I'm too slow to stand up. Not specifically about that, but the question is what happens if there's Yang 1.1 and we have any data? Would that be treated the same way?
Yeah, I think any data, it depends on what its definition is, but if it has a standard notion of layers, then I think the depth parameter would work on that. The other one still would be the same. Any XML or any data does not have any sub-naming. Any sub-naming that is part of it is just part of the instance document that is relevant to the schema. It's not part of the schema. So I think we'll have to really clarify how any data works, but I think it will have to be specifically mentioned. I think that's what you're getting at, which gives us a normative reference on Yang 1.1, which I don't want. So I would prefer not to say anything about any data, or actually anything about Yang 1.1, as it'll hold up this draft. Don't see a reason for that. But I mean, well, we could have to do follow-ups when Yang 1.1 is published. But I'm not willing to hold this up for that. Maybe others are. Going to the next slide, number 6. This issue keeps coming up, so it's like retesting the lows in a market, I guess. We have to decide if RESTconf is a mirror of Netconf and therefore is basically Netconf over HTTP, or whether it is its own protocol that has its own mechanisms. And so the specific issues are what are the databases that are exposed? The feedback I've gotten is a little mixed, but generally people are happy with the unified data store. It simplifies their programming, and if they wanted to use Netconf with all its variants, they would. They have reasons for not wanting to do that, which I think are valid. But the issues are really related to how many steps it would take to do an operation, and then there's issues of locking. We don't have any locking, and there's issue of the location URI comes back when you create a resource that's specific to a data store, and we really don't want clients to have to parse that location string and take fields out of it and splice it into other strings. That seems to be rather not the way the location header is supposed to be used. So no one's come up with a solution that would identify the same resource across data stores in a way that doesn't require the client to basically know the structure of the URL and tear it apart and put it back together again. So if someone's got a solution, someone's got a solution for that, and then they can bring it up. We could discuss this further. But to just say make RESTconf be like Netconf, to me, that's not enough. We'd have to introduce sessions, locking, and a whole lot of stuff that Netconf already has in order to do that. So, Jürgen?
Jürgen Schönfelder, the question that I had was that the unified data store is not clearly defined in terms of its persistency behavior. So you have no idea when something really gets persistent. And I think that's not very nice.
Well, Netconf doesn't really have any concept of persistence.
Well-
Only if you have a startup config, then there's one line mention of it in the cancel, confirm, commit, I believe. But for the most part, Netconf says it's up to the implementation whether it persists anything or not. Okay, so we weren't trying to add requirements that aren't in Netconf, but I have a slide on that a little later because I have seen this is a performance issue. If I know I'm going to do 100 edits at once and I actually don't want them to persist one at a time, but after the 100th one, I have no way to do that with RESTconf. And if I had a startup config, I guess then that's the only way to do that in Netconf is to have the startup config. Okay, so this is a fairly important issue, whether we're going to stick with a unified data store or expose the data stores. So we probably need to discuss this more and on the mailing list.
On the list.
Okay, next issue. So one of the possible solutions thought about is to add a parameter that would control NV storage. And then you could explicitly ask not to have your edit NV stored. I don't know if this is really needed or not, but this would be one way to approach it. And this probably isn't intuitive because it's not NV storing individual resources. It's NV storing the entire data store or not, which is the only granularity you get in Netconf as well. You don't get an option of, I only want to NV store this one little leaf over here. It's all or nothing. Dan?
Dan Bogdanovic, in a, say, NV store, either, true or false, I think it's if non-volatile store is non-volatile store, and it's, you just, everything will be stored in there, it should be persistent. And by giving the option, I think you're just confusing.
This would be exposing the capability that's in Netconf to not NV store until the client wants to. So this would probably have to be optional, because if you don't implement the startup config, then you can't do this anyways. You can't give the option of NV storing or not. But in the situations where it's slowing down performance and the client wants that control, this could be a way to do it. Currently, what happens in RESTconf is if the server supports NV storage, it does it after every edit. So the performance is significantly worse than one would expect. If you did it, 100 edits and then did a commit, and that's, did a copy running to startup, that's much faster. Okay, the next slide is about RESTconf specific data, and this is particularly the data resource identifier that's, I think it's only used in example jukebox, or I don't know, but the point is that it's a RESTconf specific format of a path, and it's not an XPath path expression like Netconf uses. It's a URL kind of thing that's more HTTP-like, which is what RESTconf is doing. So the issue is whether or not RESTconf should be using XPath path expressions just like Netconf to talk about all the location of the nodes or not. I don't know the good simple answer here. It's
So Martin Merklund, I have a comment on that. I think that maybe you're mixing two things. You know, the URL could stay as it is with this data resource identifier, but that doesn't mean that we have to have that as a data type that's being used in data models.
okay.
Right.
Well, the place that it's used is in Yang patch, and if Yang patch changes dramatically, then this goes away anyways. And then a higher level, I guess, issue is some people have talked about the simplified notion that every module on the server, every module in the device will be implemented by every protocol using Yang. I don't believe that. Right now we have today IETF netconf.yang. It is not appropriate for RESTconf to implement that. We have IETF RESTconf.yang. It is not appropriate for netconf to implement that. We might have I2RS modules, and it's not appropriate for netconf or RESTconf to implement that. There's going to be COMI that's going to use Yang, and that may have its own specific things, but I doubt it. I think there will be a need to identify which protocols are claiming to implement a particular module. And so that would be some support in the Yang library that we'll talk about in a bit.
Jürgen Schönwelder, so I'm concerned about people accidentally making something protocol specific that doesn't need to be protocol specific. The fact that there might be some modules where it's perfectly fine that they're protocol specific is
Okay.
not a counter argument for that.
Okay, so as a general guideline, we should avoid having any protocol-specific data structures and mechanisms. That sounds fine. So we'll make an effort to take out anything RESTconf specific in the data models and in the examples. So next slide.
Pardon?
Oh, I'm sorry, Phil, I didn't see you.
Phil Schaefer, Juniper. So why don't you have the expectation that every module a box supports will be available over RESTconf and over NetConf? Given that one expects to be able to pull down a full configuration and restore a full configuration, I'm not sure I understand why.
Well, a lot of the RPC operations in NetConf are session specific, and RESTconf has no concept of sessions. So for instance, what do you do about a lock? You lock
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about Yang modules. So I'm saying if I...
Well, Yang
if I have a
modules
device-
are allowed to have RPC statements in them, right?
Okay.
So,
So there'll be RPCs in Yang modules that I can't get to through RESTconf?
well, they're written for NetConf, and they're tied to the way sessions work, and we don't have sessions. So I guess you'd have to figure out what, they don't work the same. If I'm supposed to release this lock when the NetConf session is terminated, but there's no NetConf session, then I don't know how I implement that. I agree with you that data within the data store should be accessible by RESTconf and NetConf. I don't know that I'd force it, but I'd certainly encourage it.
Well, if you... So that would have been my expectation, that these are two access means to access the same data. If you're saying that you're not accessing the same data, I'm wondering what we're doing and how this is helping interoperability when I can get some Yang modules this way and some Yang modules this way, and having Yang take a simplified view of things like unified data store may be helpful to the target audience of RESTconf. And that doesn't necessarily break the ability to implement all of your Yang modules through both access methods. It's just a simplified procedure to get to the same data. But when you say that you don't have the expectation that every Yang module will be available via both access methods, that sets off the red alarms.
It could be implementation restrictions that they've written the code for Netconf, and they haven't got around to duplicating it all for RESTconf, and they're releasing code anyways. I don't think that should be restricted. That's a business, a marketing decision. You want to have support for 10 modules or 1,000, it's up to you. It's not, we don't have an expectation that CLI can get to everything that S&P can, or S&P can get to everything that CLI can, and all these sort of things. So I think it's up to the implementer to decide what they expose in their API.
I have a very strong expectation that when I do a get config operation, that the data that I get back can be loaded back onto the device via edit config operation with override or whatever, and that I have saved and restored the state of that device.
Yeah, but that's all within one protocol.
So I would suggest to take this to the list.
Okay.
Okay, all right, slide 9. So another comment was that the insert and point parameters are optional, and this means that Yang user order lists cannot be patched without basically replacing the entire user ordered list or leaf list. So the question is should this be mandatory, or again a vendor decision to decide if they want to support that level of complexity? So currently it says it's optional, but if we decided that it's mandatory to implement for all implementations of RESTconf, then that'll change.
Peter Van Horn from Cisco. Based on our discussion about the IETF ACL model this morning and ordered by user, this should probably be mandatory.
Okay, we've had discussions for constrained devices where we don't want any user order data in the box because it's basically a hidden variable. It's basically using the order of the data as an index, which can be done. You don't have to do it that way, but if it's mandatory and the box doesn't implement any user order data, then you can advertise support for this and not have to do anything. So, but okay, we have to take that to the list as well, I guess, if those are mandatory.
Yes.
Okay. So, in summary, there's a lot of comments from Jürgen that I didn't talk about, and they're mostly editorial in nature and clarifications and inconsistencies that we'll go through the text and see if we can fix it. We would like to get more cross-area reviews and more comments on the draft, and also really kind of decide what the scope of this is and if it's okay that it's not Netconf over HTTP. Now, I have heard, and of course, not any kind of scientific data, but the people that like RESTconf know about Netconf and know they don't want to use it. And they don't want to hear me tell them, no, you're just not smart enough, just use Netconf. And later on you'll understand why. They don't want to hear that, but Netconf is available, RESTconf should be available too, but as a lighter weight protocol. I think some of the issues that I2RS brought up originally about the complexities of writing to state and interacting with other data stores, is a valid reason to consider why the unified data store might be a solution path for more protocols than Netconf.
Since you mentioned I2RS, I think we get back to that later anyway. But clearly there was lots of talk of having a distinction between ephemeral state and config state. I'm not sure how this unified data store gets you there. But
no, you'd have to have something in the URL to say you want the special operational state. I agree with Phil that the talk this morning about separating state, and because sometimes the config is not actually active because some protocols have injected something or something like that. The way to do that is to have an operational data store and not put it in the data model at all. But yeah, that could be a different discussion. And we haven't made many progress on this collection stuff, which we'll get to in a minute. So that's it for RESTconf. I guess the next one.
So, as a matter of fact, we need more reviewers. As you already mentioned, we need cross-working group review. The coaches are in the process of asking other working group chairs to assign reviewers directly. So we will have some names who will be then in charge to review RESTconf. So we will go to a second working group last call. This is obvious. A question to Andy is, when do you think to start the working group last call makes sense?
Well, you're asking when can we get -05 out? Because we're not going to working group last call this one. I don't know. Well, we're supposed to meet tomorrow to work on the draft, and hopefully we'll make progress.
Okay, the general aim is to start it as soon as possible, yeah.
So I would say within a couple of weeks.
Phil Schaefer, do you need to answer that third question before you go to last call? What's the scope? What is it you're making? I mean, that's...
Yeah, I guess we do, and so it's up to people who think that the current scope is correct to speak up on the mailing list if you think we should keep RESTconf a unified data store instead of a more Netconf-like.
Andy, we are behind the time somehow, so please.
All right. So Yang patch, go through some open issues. Next slide. There were issues resolved. Next slide. So the big issue came up from Phil is, why are we doing a new kind of editing? Why don't we just use the Netconf edit config? So the rationale for doing a new kind of edit was to make it easier to understand and hopefully more interoperable. Right now, it's possible that Netconf could be clarified so that behavior for the corner cases in edit config could be defined. Currently, they're not. Things like nested operations aren't really defined. Having subtrees appear multiple times in the config blob is not handled. There's things like that where it's completely up to the implementation what they're going to do. So the issue really is introducing a new method at all to do editing, because we already have the edit config. So they're probably not that important of arguments, but I think the fact that RESTconf is supposed to be resource-oriented, there's nothing resource-oriented about Netconf or edit config. It's just a patch on the entire data store, whereas the Yang patch is supposed to be patch on a target resource. I don't know if that's important enough. In fact, you could still do a patch on the target resource with just an edit config blob. It's really the structure of the edit is the issue here. So there was another issue too, as well, as far as the Yang patch status having some increased error granularity, and it's speculation on my part that would actually help a client figure out what went wrong on a complex edit. Currently, there aren't any guidelines for returning multiple edits or multiple errors from an edit config, but chances are you'd get the same kind of errors that you would from from Netconf. There's no guarantee that knowing that the error was associated with edit number 3 versus edit number 5 really mattered. So I'd, give that as a argument. So the next slide.
Hold on, please.
Okay, Phil.
So your comment that operations are poorly specified with regard to corner cases, is that something we should be clearing up in Yang 1.1? I mean, if you're saying nested operations and, you have a couple examples there, are these issues that we should raise in the 1.1 effort? What are the, maybe you should fully verse what, either here on the list, what these corner cases are.
Okay, Martin?
Yeah, Martin Björklund. So I don't think it's a Yang issue, it's a Netconf issue. So it doesn't make sense to clarify in the Yang spec.
Well, Netconf essentially says config is your baby, you can do what you want. So you're saying that Yang clarifies these?
I think the issue here is what happens if, for example, in your edit config, you're trying to modify the same thing twice. Or what happens if you have under your, if you have the delete operation and under there you have create or something, what does it mean?
So
I
is
think
that
those
stuff
are the
that we should
corner
be
cases.
clarifying in
Probably
in
clarify,
Yang
but not
1.1?
in the Yang document.
Okay.
Yeah, it could, certainly could be clarified what the corner cases are, what you're supposed to do with them. There was also an issue of that I'm a little concerned about is that attributes only work well in XML. And the encoding, JSON is just horrible for streaming. It's horrible for parsing. It's when you start having this data that can appear anywhere, but it's really tied to this other data that can appear anywhere. It means you have to basically buffer all of it, and XML doesn't have that requirement. So it's supposed to be intuitive that JSON is so much better, it's so much more efficient. Actually, within a real server, it's much worse and much more complicated to implement than XML. But so that's one reason I'd really not to use attributes, but that's, you could call that an implementation detail, and people just have to deal with it. Okay, and I'm not sure, Jürgen, what is this comment about? Why not have a RPC operation?
Jürgen Schönwelder. So the interesting bit here, it's called Yang patch. If you read the document, it's more doing RESTconf patch with a little bit of hand-waving text. It might also apply to Netconf, but then the way it's defined, it makes assumptions of resource identification, which uses resource identifiers rather than instance identifiers. So it's part of the scope discussion. So which problem are we solving here? And is the idea that a management application really has to be able to generate a Yang patch blob for a RESTconf device, and when it talks to a Netconf device, it needs to create an equivalent edit config. So is that the model we want to go to?
Yeah, good question. And so one option is to take out all of the text that refers to Netconf and say that it's RESTconf specific. This is what I would prefer to do. Okay, so any comments on that? Okay, okay, Martin.
Yeah, Martin. So why not make it possible to use it over Netconf as well, if it's a nicer edit method?
Well,
so you've listed all the reasons for why this is nicer than edit config, right? So that probably applies to Netconf as well.
okay, I guess once we decide to take all this out and make it just like edit config, then it seems rather pointless to do edit config two ways. You just use edit config in Netconf. Why would you use a different operation in Netconf? Well, I guess we'll take it to the list. We'll look at that more closely of what it means to make it protocol independent.
Phil Schaefer. And you can make the same comment for the unified database. If it's nice to have, it would be nice to have in Netconf as well. Just a unified, data store equals unified.
Well, I kind of remember that was your first idea when we
That was.
doing XML Conf design team.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, I wish we did it because it really exposing all the variability to the client pushes the complexity to the client, which is a decision we made. Okay, on this one, why is it useful to have absolute and relative target paths? Not sure. That was the way the edit list was defined. So your target resource points to, I guess, the parent resource or the resource being edited, and then each edit within the Yang patch can be doing things within that resource. If we go to an edit config model, then this list thing goes away and all of these relative paths go away because the paths are now implied by the subtree blob that you hand off to the server. So why is there an automatic commit to startup? Well, because the unified server doesn't have any way to not do that. So some of these issues are all related in the scope discussion, and I guess we'll have to just figure it out on the list what people really expect out of this. I have heard several people say they want all the things in Netconf, but just over HTTP. I've heard other people say we just want to do a simple, libcurl kind of thing. I send you a request, you send me an answer, I'm done. That's it. I don't want any more. So there's two completely different camps of users, and I don't think we're going to satisfy both of them by cutting it down the middle and making it kind of bad for both of them. But let's see what the working group has to say on the mailing list about that. So we have to figure out our scope and decide the detailed text that talks about data resource offset and other things, and get all that cleaned up, I guess. We'll see what we can do about that. So next one.
So there are so many of them. Can we take the rest to the list? I don't know.
Okay, we'll go, yes. Any XML is underspecified, yes, we'll have to figure it out. So the three choices we can do with the Yang patch are start over, forget about it, or continue on the path we're on. So is there any opinion which of these three choices we should do?
Kent Watson. I prefer going on the path we're on now, and to Martin's point, perhaps finding a way to bring it to Netconf as well.
Okay, I did a draft called Netconf Extensions that did all that. It expired. But I suppose, we'll look at that again. People could do new drafts. I got the impression that Netconf was completely uninterested in anything that had to do with efficiency. Okay, so I'm going to the core working group instead. Okay, next, sorry.
But Jürgen Schönwelder, at the end, what you're doing is you're defining a new RPC, right? And that should just work. If the first thing we define is already not working across two protocols, then I think we have a problem.
Okay.
Phil Schaefer?
Okay, go ahead, Phil.
My comment's just that anything we can do to maximize the overlap, minimize the code, the differences between these two, maximize the functionality that we get out of single implementations, to me is goodness.
Okay, I've started to implement Yang patch, and it does add new code. There's no doubt about it that didn't have to be there before. So I'm not super stuck on this edit list approach, especially since, and I wanted to see, does anyone else think it's confusing? The order of these edits actually means nothing. The validation happens at the end. And so you can separate the edits into a list, but the order of them really is not something the server needs to, there's no way to tell if the server actually followed that order, because it's not validated until the end, and you don't get an answer, yes or no, until the end.
But if you modify the same resource, you can set the same leaf twice in two different edits, then the order matters, right? And it's actually specified. This is one of the corner cases that we talked about that actually is specified here. So the
Yeah,
order-
and it would be specified here. I really don't know that that's a use case, that to set the same nodes twice, but...
Well, maybe you delete one first and then, yeah. I guess you could just replace, yeah.
So, Andy, go ahead. We are already
Okay.
10 minutes behind the time.
I'm sorry. Well, you know, we're months behind, and we're trying to get these
Yeah.
drafts done, and we don't do this.
I'm not
We wait
cutting
4
off,
months.
so go ahead.
Okay, so the Yang library is a document that was split out of RESTconf so that it could be used by multiple protocols, and it's basically an inventory of Yang modules. And so there was a couple issues. The conformance leaf, Martin suggested changing it to enumeration, and I'm not sure what the exact enums would be, but that sounds like a good idea, so that we could extend it later if we have more values than true false. That was an issue. Yes, Vlada?
I think this conformance is a bit confusing. First, the name, like conformance, may mean quite a lot more than what it really means, and it really means that you want to use only groupings and type defs, right? If I understand it correctly. But in this case, again, the Netconf rule, I believe, is that in such case, such a module needn't be advertised. So I don't know, would it be possible just to remove it from?
No. This is the inventory of all the modules. This is not the advertisement of I claim conformance to all of this. So we could remove it, and then there would be no mechanism for protocols like RESTconf or COMI to distinguish between modules that I am listing so that you know the complete list of modules and revisions that I have versus modules I am claiming conformance to.
I think it comes down again to the discussion about what really conformance and imports by revision mean, but yeah, maybe we can discuss.
Yeah, this is, unless the revision date is mandatory to use everywhere, then this is useful, because it provides you the names and revisions of all the modules that the server is using. So that helps you go find them. Otherwise, if you don't have the revision date, it becomes kind of non-deterministic what ends up happening. So the multi-protocol support issue goes back to what Phil was saying. Yeah, if there is no expectation that different modules would be protocol specific, then this isn't needed. If every module is accessible completely through all protocols, then having a leaf to say what, or a leaf list to say what we're doing, which protocols are using this module, isn't needed. So currently this is not in there, and I don't think we're going to add it unless people really want that. Okay. This issue of REST Netconf monitoring is, I think it should be closed now. We're not discussing anything about a get schema and the schema list. An implementation is free to do something with that if they want to, but we're not coupling to that module. Okay, so we need to finish up these issues and get the leafs in there if we're going to put them in. Otherwise, we'll just finish up and go to working loop last call.
So just to mention, our aim is to go to last call with the 3 drafts, RESTconf, Yang patch, and Yang library together.
Okay. And the last draft is is the collection draft, which unfortunately we don't have a lot to say on it because the authors did not work on it since the last meeting. So we're supposed to meet tomorrow or something to talk about and see if we can finish these last two parameters to add in for the collection resource draft.
I
Hopefully we can get that
I
done real
think
fast.
that really finishing these documents means that we have to resolve somehow the dependency on the Yang JSON draft. And as you remember, yesterday the conclusion was that essentially some features from Yang 1.1 would be included in the Yang JSON document, and that of course means delay. So even though Andy said that he didn't want to have any Yang 1.1 features in RESTconf, just this conclusion from the NetMod working group means that this delay would be here, and this indirect dependence on the Yang 1.1 will still be present. So I don't know, maybe really I wasn't really in favor of putting this Yang 1.1 features in the Yang JSON document either, but there are some of course consequences for this as well.
I share your concern. I don't want this held up for a really long time, but we'll. There was a comment from Jürgen that since XML is mandatory, now we need to show lots of examples in XML, and I don't know if everything is going to be XML or JSON. At this point, I really care if we drop JSON completely.
Ken Watson, that was going to be my comment. We could just remove JSON from the draft for now.
It could come back later. I've actually heard more interest in using CBOR than JSON.
What you hear is always a function of whom you talk to.
Right. And people seek me out and say, can you do this to your draft? This is what I want in it.
So looking at Yang Patch, that's the natural customer for any data. So, and given that Yang 1.1 should be a complete document that goes to working group last call April. Yes, we don't know what happens once we go through the last call process, but I think it's the same set of people, right? We should just get it consistently shipped out.
That's it, right?
Okay, that's it.
Thanks. Kent. Whatever you can say is fine.
Yeah, I mean, we can go through them and have questions, but if it takes long, we will take minutes.
Hi, Ken Watson, Juniper Networks. So first, Netconf call home, RESTconf call home. There's a few updates since 91. We added RESTconf protocol, removed the terminology TCP session, and also the term verify credentials was replaced with verify identity. Tried to improve readability and added a big section at the beginning on RFC instructions. Next slide, please. So there were 4 respondents. Thank you, Martin, Jürgen, Tom Petch, and Rohit. There were no significant issues with the content. I think that's the main thing. We're no longer talking about document structure or the scope of the document, or, I mean, it seems like we have the right document. It's just there was Rohit called out a need for us to further clarify the client-server roles, and also there's numerous editorial suggestions. Next slide, please. So the next steps, I'm waiting for some on-list responses before applying some changes, but I hope to submit call home 05 in the next couple weeks, and another last call may be necessary.
Yeah, this is again together with a server model, so we will go then to the last call.
So the next presentation is on the server model. So it's the Yeah, okay, some updates. Just quickly, removed the Yang 1.1 style if feature statements, removed the read-only list of SSH host keys and TL certificates, added an ability to configure trust anchors for X59 client certificates. It now imports by revision because I thought that was best practice. We'll touch on this one again in a second. Added support for the RESTconf server, added RFC instructions, added NACM statements. There's new client start off subtree, added description as a minor thing. Okay, next slide, please. Last call results. There are model changes needed, significant reviews. Okay, open issue, sure. All right, so there's 13 open issues. Actually, most of these are from Jürgen, so if they look familiar, that's why.
Yeah, let's look at them. I mean, we can spend one or the other minute, have a question, but at the end we need to go to the list.
Yes. So all 13 of these issues I opened on GitHub. They're currently in the news state, and my goal is to either make them be dead or open them. And so we can start to discuss them here, open them here. First one is rename the application node to RESTconf client. Currently it's called application in the tree. This is for the call home tree. So you can imagine, for instance, in CLI or whatever, what do people think if it's the term REST application or Netconf client? Any comments or suggestions?
Go ahead.
No? Okay, next. Is it a good idea to name the top-level node Netconf server? Actually, I don't know if I understand the question exactly. It makes a lot of sense to me. Of course, there's the same comment with RESTconf server, so there's two models. There is a precedent, I think. 6022 has Netconf state. It seems similar to me. Okay, next issue. Are the current features granular enough? So if you recall previously I was using Yang 1.1 feature statements, and then I was told not to do that. I broke it up into these. The issue is that you can't actually have a device that does Netconf listen on SSH, only SSH, and yet do Netconf call home with only TLS, right? If you advertise support for SSH and you advertise support for call home and listen, you're going to do it for both. Actually, I don't personally see this as an issue as from a developer's perspective. If the code has been written to support SSH or TLS, then of course you're going to support both protocols for the listen or call home cases that your device supports. So, no comments? Okay, next slide. Is import by revision needed? Okay, so at the time I submitted the draft, it was my understanding that import by revision was best practice, and that prior Yang modules were in effect in violation. Recent Yang.1 conformance discussions seem to be swinging the other direction now, but with potential to swing back again. It's unclear to me what the right thing to do is, and so perhaps taking it out is the way to go, because even if it's wrong, at least it's in good company of all the other RFC modules that we've published. So, any comments, sir? This is a larger discussion regarding import by revision. So next slide. So there were some comments about the upper bounds on various nodes, the hello timeout and idle timeout, max sessions. I don't know if there was this particular Yang was copy pasted from a contributor, and I don't know if there were like reasons for those values or just gut feeling. But anyway, I think generally speaking we should not have upper bounds and allow the system to specify it. Okay, so 39, move away from a number with a fixed unit. Okay, so removing upper bounds is well and good, but large values can become unreadable. For example, 3 days. Would you rather have 3 days, or would you like to have 259,200 seconds? If everything is specified in seconds, then you wind up these obscene values. So one option might be to have a two-tuple. For instance, one leaf for specifying the numerical value and another leaf for enumeration. A different suggestion was to do something like XSD's duration, where you have an encoding that captures the variations of the time.
Andy Bierman, I prefer just seconds. That's a presentation issue. The NMS can convert to whatever time frame it wants.
Phil Schaefer, ditto. Complexity breeds bugs.
All right, so 2 comments there. Great, thank you. Next slide, please. Move max sessions to global sessions parameters. So currently, the max sessions parameter is underneath the listen leaf, or container, sorry, listen container. So if it were moved to the global level, then presumably it would apply to both call home and listen sessions. So what's the total number of sessions the device can have regardless of how they were initiated? It may lead to a pathological case where you have, the total number of configured call home sessions exceeding your configured max session limit. But I think in XPath, a must expression could capture this, and then through validation, it could be captured, right? So we could do, sorry, previous slide, yeah. So you could do a count on the number of configured call home applications, and then ensure that it's less than or equal to the configured max session.
So Martin Buckler, is it obvious that that's needed? No, I mean, if you have periodic call homes, it's not, I mean, it seems like you could probably have more call home applications than current, because max session is going to be current sessions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure that this last statement is correct.
Right. I was thinking persistent connections, but you're right. For the periodic connections, they're not necessarily all on at the same time. Okay, good. Next slide, please. Should address be mandatory? So currently, neither address nor port are mandatory for a listening endpoint, but port has a default. So for instance, if you're listening for Netconf, it's 8:30. So should address be mandatory? Or should no specified address be treated like a wildcard? So many operating systems allow you to do an asterisk or 0 to represent any interface. So I'd say if address is not configured, then it means all interfaces. Okay. I'm going to take that one to the list, but that's the proposal. 43, keep alive, linger, reconnect, interval, defaults, okay. You can see the defaults for the interval sec, how often should the device be trying to see if it needs to bring up the call home connection again. Once it has exchanged data and it's just waiting to tear down the session, I mean, the normal thing would be to close the communication immediately, but instead, if you had something to send once, there's a good chance you're going to want to send something again within a certain amount of time, so how long do you wait? And then lastly, when you're trying to reconnect, I think I wrote 5 minutes, supposed to be 5 seconds, but when you're trying to reconnect, yeah, it even says seconds, interval seconds. When you're trying to reconnect between your application servers, what's the delay between those reconnect attempts? So these were just my gut instinct values, what I thought would be making sense. I think the question was there any particular reason? That's the reason. If anyone has an issue with these values, bring it up, otherwise we're going to use these. Next slide, please. How to do interval secs and count maps work for reconnect strategy and endpoint results to multiple IP addresses. Oh, yes. Okay, so the normal thing is you have a list of servers that you're trying to connect to. The servers themselves could be specified using host name, and during DNS resolution, the host name could expand to a list of IP addresses. So how do we handle that? I think it's just a matter of documenting that the expansions would be treated, in line, and you're still effectively doing round robin on the list, even with the IP expansions. Any comments? Next one, please. Okay, so there's this, in the call home draft, there's a section on keep alive and how to do implementation of keep alive, and we're really implementing keep alives at the transport layer. So in specific with TLS, the TLS protocol requires that the server, the remote peer, advertise this flag, peer allowed to send, meaning that then you're allowed to ping the other side to, are you alive? Are you alive? So the other side has to actually advertise. So we want it to be the case that devices that are calling home should be able to do keep alives, right? They should be able to, but in order for that to be the case, the application must advertise this flag. So currently the text is in the server model draft, and it probably should be moved to the call home draft.
So Michael Abrams, I don't understand. Is this on TCP keep lives or is it
TLS?
TLS keep
Yes.
lives? Okay. And the reason for not using TCP keep lives is?
because they're not encrypted. They can be spoofed.
Okay. Okay.
All right, next slide, please. Okay, so perhaps introduce a second timeout for periodic connections for when there is data to send. So currently the text says a device should proactively connect to a client if it has messages to send. This would be before its normal timeout. So if a device, for instance, is configured to call home once a day, but somewhere in the middle of the day it gets some alarms or faults, it should be able to proactively connect before then. And so the question is, should we just leave the text as is, should proactively, or maybe have another configurable timer, which would be less than the periodic timer, for how long the device should wait before it flushes that data, or use an absolute time, something like 2 a.m.
Martin Björklund, a fourth option would be just to say may instead of should. And more or less leave, the configuration of that to implementations.
Sure. Another comment was to combine the trusted CA certs and trusted client cert trees for SSH and TLS. Currently, the certificates the device trusts are being configured once for SSH and again for TLS transport. This actually doesn't make sense to me. It came out that way because the two transports were defined separately, but it does make sense to bring them together. One issue might be how to set the if feature statement. So currently, so if they're brought together, then when would you configure them? So if you're TLS, then you always need to configure who your trusted certificates are. But if for SSH, you only need to configure who your trusted certificates are when you're supporting the X509 certificates, which is RFC 6781, I think. So you really would like to have a if feature statement to say when the TLS certificate, when you can configure them. The problem is that you would almost need to use Yang 1.1 syntax, something like an or, if either of these two features are being allowed, then, or we could define some larger string called SSH X509 or TLS and declare that as a feature.
Phil Schaefer. So there have been a lot of odd comments about, we don't want to depend on Yang 1.1. We believe in Yang 1.1, and we think it's going to happen imminently. And given that we think these standards are going to live for a long time, I don't understand the hang-up between the hang-up on relying on Yang 1.1 features, that we think is going to be, given that we think Yang 1.1 will be the most excellent stuff. So I don't understand that sentiment.
Yeah, I think it came from Honolulu, where we felt that we'd be able to get into last call in the December timeframe. But now, so where we're at today, I think I actually agree with your statement that.
But even if you have to, even if the RFC publication waits 6 months, I mean, I don't know what the time frame for 1.1 is, but it can't be that far off.
Jürgen just mentioned maybe in 1 month time, it would go into last call.
If Yang 1.1 goes in 1 month time frame to last call, this does not mean it is finished in 2 months. I mean, it can take a long time.
But again, I'm saying if it's a 6-month window, all these will go to last call about the same time, and they'll all become RFCs about the same time.
Yeah, as Ken said, this was a decision from the last meeting. We didn't want to wait until Yang 1.1 is available before going to last call. So we can ask the same question here again. Whether we want to make these drafts dependent on Yang 1.1 or not. Okay. So what is the sense of the room? I mean, should we wait or make these drafts dependent on Yang 1.1? Please show hands if you think so, that we should introduce features which will be available in Yang 1.1.
Which question are you asking?
So the question is whether the current draft and related drafts should use Yang 1.1 features, and with that, the drafts will be dependent on Yang 1.1, although we don't know how long it takes to finalize it and when it is going to be published. So people who think we should introduce Yang 1.1 features in these drafts, please show hands. So, and people who are against using Yang 1.1 features because the waiting time would be long.
And the amount of features we're using isn't very much. And there's no tools yet.
So this is kind of approximately 12
I disagree
against...
with the statement that the waiting time will be long, right?
Say it again?
It's undefined, probably, but it's not necessarily long.
Okay. But again, I mean, Andy was the only person who showed hand for the second question. So this is actually something we are noting now. We will verify on the mail list, but the sense of the room seems to be that we should introduce Yang 1.1 features. Kent.
Okay, great, thank
So,
you. Next.
can you
slide.
just...
Should I? Okay, so next up, we just need to work through these issues, submit the server model 07 draft as soon as possible, and another last call will definitely be necessary. Thank you.
Okay, I just would like to come back to slide 15. This seems to me a bigger issue compared to others. So you are proposing to move entire section 5 to call home draft. I would like to understand whether this is really needed.
So this section is documenting what developers would have to consider at the protocol level. There's nothing in this that would lead to the server model itself. There's this text is separate from this text is in the server model nodes for configuring Keep Alive. But this is text not for how to, the configuration model. It's more about the implementation of how to do how to implement Keep Alives. So I figured it was a protocol issue. That's why.
Phil Schaefer. So I had a question before, and I didn't voice it. But is the security risk represented by allowing replay of SSH Keep Alive significant enough to matter?
I'm not sure, but when looking at the postings from various sources on why they implemented Keep Alives in SSH and Keep Alives in TLS, the rationale is always because that then makes it so they're not spoofable. And whether or not that's important to us, how important it is to us, I'm not sure. But we are, in this case, talking about the device calling home to the network management system. And if that connection goes down, we really want to be able to understand or discover that that connection went down as quickly as possible, so we can proactively bring it up again. If it were to go down and someone was spoofing the Keep Alives, it may actually think it was still up, even though it was down.
Okay.
Jeff Haas, very briefly, the reason why you typically do Keep Alives within the protocol is that if you don't do it within the protocol, there's a chance that some other component that's supposed to be handling it is not actually handling it in exactly the same fashion. So the fact that SSH may think it's up may not necessarily be the same thing that the components living on top of SSH. And what you really care about is the application that's at the far end.
So, but on that point, that's not what we're doing. We're not doing application level Keep Alives. We're doing transport level Keep Alives.
So, okay, let us finish this part. I would like to suggest to reduce the amount of necessary discussion. There are proposals for most of the issues. For some of them, there are some optional proposals. I mean, if anybody has an objection to proposed solution, please speak up on the mail list. If there are 2 or 3 proposal options, please state your opinion which option should be followed as solution. So we would like to take the discussion to the main list.
Yeah, and as mentioned, these are all currently new open issues, and for each one, I'll start a thread.
Yeah.
And either we'll drive it to dead or done.
So at the end, the editor of the draft will always ask if there is no objection, he's going to realize that solution. So let us short up the discussion a bit. Unfortunately, we don't have much time. So I mean, based on the official agenda, you have only 5 minutes, but please take your 10 minutes, then let us finish that part.
Next slide, please. Zero touch presentation. So there were some issues last time, namely that the owners would have to interact with the third-party signing server system. It was essentially a loss of privacy. Additionally, the configuration that was being signed, we called it a configlet. It actually had inside of it an enumerated list of unique device identifiers, which meant that the configlet was effectively locked to a set of devices. So that was a loss of portability. It was also undefined how a third-party signing entity would be able to be created. It implies a real-time lookup service of some sort. Actually, there were additional issues having to do with XML sec and XML sig, and as well as how we would support XML versus JSON encodings. Next slide, please. So if you recall, there was sort of a request to the working group member to go back to your companies and have a conversation about the implementability of this solution. I did that with my own company and found that the previous solution was actually complicated. It would be difficult to realize. And so that I went back to the drawing board just a little bit, and the previous solution was kind of optimized for the device. And then I said, okay, what would be optimized for the vendor? What would be the easiest thing for the vendor, given the touch points that they already are having with customers, especially like point of sale and whatnot. And so a new idea or proposal came forward, which is this notion of replacing the third-party signing authority with the notion of a rightful owner now being able to sign their own configurations, and that the devices use a vendor-provided voucher, which effectively vouches for the fact that that particular owner owns that unique identifier, which solved all the issues that we just talked about. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next. Okay, so graphically, you have the rightful owner, a one-time setup enrollment where they would interact with the vendor or a delegate of the vendor to obtain a owner certificate. So they create a private key, submit a certificate signing request, get back a certificate that has a unique identifier, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then later, when they go to place an order for some devices, when the devices are actually shipped, they would get also these things called vouchers, which is essentially a file that contains their unique identifier, the list of device unique identifiers, such as serial numbers, and signed by the vendor or their delegate. Next slide, please. So with this, the NMS system, and here we're using NMS very loosely, it could be OSS, BASS, whatever, but the NMS would be configured with a list of expected unique identifiers, what serial numbers are you expecting to call home into you. Also, they may optionally configure a local DHCP server. This is just simply a means for discovering other Bootstrap servers that they may be able to connect to. But here's the main important thing, number 3. On the Bootstrap server, they place the files, the owner certificate, and the voucher that we discussed in the previous slide. The configuration, which is now just any configuration, any normal configuration, like what you might get back from getconfig. It could be JSON encoded, XML encoded, doesn't matter. It's not a configlet anymore. There's no data model that's describing it other than the vendor-specific Yang data model. And then a signature, right, a detached signature. So I'm saying here they put on a Bootstrap server, but I should clarify, and the draft does, that these are really files at rest. How they are obtained is not material. They could be loaded from a USB flash or over optical or IP, layer 2, layer 3. It actually doesn't matter how they're obtained. Next slide, please. So we did define a Bootstrap server API, a southbound interface API, using Yang and RESTconf. You see it's a bunch of read-only nodes because the device is effectively just getting these files from the server, but also implements a RPC for notifications, so that the device can basically post success or failures notifications to the Bootstrap server. Next slide. So here you can see how some of those APIs play out. Thank you. So this is essentially the logic the device would go through. It obtains these files. The first thing it does is it looks to the voucher, and it says, was it signed by my vendor or delegate? Does it contain my serial number? And if it does, then it extracts the owner ID. Then it goes to the owner certificate and says, was this signed by my vendor? Yes, it was. Does it have the matching owner ID? If it does, great. Then it extracts the public key, and now using the public key can validate the signature on the configuration. Effectively cryptographically validating that the configuration that it's being asked to load was signed by the entity that the vendor vouches to own that particular device. So there were a couple open issues for a long time, which we've resolved. Next slide, please. There are a couple new issues, which is how to implement the binary signing algorithm. Next slide, please. So immediately after this session, there's a Anima working group session where I'll be presenting Zero Touch there as well. So please come to that session if you'd like to learn more about it and how it might be used in autonomic networking or home net environments. Also, we need to close the current issues and submit 0.3 in a few weeks. I say a few weeks because I need to do call home and server model updates first. So it's last in the queue. That's it.
I have a question concerning the discussion together with Anima working group people. So you are discussing right now offline with them on their needs and requirements?
Yes.
So there will be the Anima working group session right after this session,
Yes.
I assume in the same room, right?
Sure.
What I would like, or the chairs, and as I discussed also the our AD would like to see is that Anima working group provides an agreed requirement or a set of requirements to Netconf working group instead of just discussing them offline and agreeing and updating the draft. We need to discuss those requirements in Netconf working group first before adopting them. So this would be indeed interesting if they provide a new draft or write the requirements down in an existing draft they have as directed to Netconf. So if we have kind of a written text which we can discuss in Netconf workgroup session or Netconf mail list, this would be good.
So two quick responses. First, the update here was based on feedback from this working group, and it resolves the issues that we came up with.
I'm just talking on the future.
And the second thing is, and as we'll be discussing in the next session, trying to understand what are the use cases and how they are the same or vary, or that is actually the essence of what we're trying to understand. It's more like we're trying to understand the scope of the problem that we're sharing, not necessarily coming to the solutions just yet. If that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the general process is actually to avoid competing requirements coming into Netconf working group. So the requirements coming from another working group need to be agreed first in that working group.
So Michael Abrahamson, they're working on a lot is bootstrapping. They're not working on Netconf. So for them to bring their bootstrapping requirements to here, I don't think that they will do that.
So I don't understand that.
So
I mean, if they have requirements, let me ask the question. If they have requirements to Netconf Zero Touch draft, we need to get them in a coordinated manner.
Okay, so they have nothing to do
so
with Netconf.
It is not going to work out if somebody tells Kent what he has to do in Zero Touch draft and he begins working.
Hi, this is Xin, Anima chair. As far as I understand, so far we don't have, raise any official requirement to zero touch yet. I know there are some technology overlap between the zero touch and Bootstrap, the other behind me, but that is what we are going to talk, next session. Try to find out, what's the overlap. Try to, not get the competition solutions. Whatever the requirements, if that's going to relevant to Netconf here, for sure, we will be, operating in the coordination way to make sure the Netconf working group can agree on that, for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Michael Berenger, co-author of the draft predicate of the similar draft. That draft has been around for quite some time. In Anima, there is a requirement that nodes can talk to each other without the involvement of a central node. So whereas in Netconf, you authenticate yourself towards a central server, and that's basically always the same model. In Anima, that is not where we are starting. In fact, we want to have horizontal authentication. Therefore, our starting point is to get a certificate down there such that the devices can talk to each other directly. That is slightly different from this approach. Having said that, over lunch we were just talking, Kent and I think we can merge the two requirements. But it's not as simple as saying we have the following requirements in Netconf.
It is just fine. We will probably discuss those requirements in Anima working group session again. So let's do it there first. But as a matter of fact, at the end, we need written text to exchange between working groups. What you said verbally is nice, but it is not sufficient to start work on it.
There's a lot of work to be done.
Okay, thanks. Jeff, unfortunately, we are behind the time, so whatever you can say is perfect.
Okay, very quickly, blue sheets, wherever they are, can you make them come forward? And if anyone has not signed, please sign the blue sheet.
So let us, Jeff, let us keep it as 10 minutes or so. Is okay?
Okay. So I'm here in my capacity as I2RS co-chair to say here's where we are with our requirements towards Netconf. Next slide, please.
Oops.
Is this first slide?
I was on that slide. Okay, this is your first slide now.
Okay, thank you. So the status of the requirements, I have a draft that I've been using to try to assemble what I believe is the consensus of the working group. This is not specifically a document that's been formally adopted by I2RS. It's more of a running to-do list. The goal of this document is to go away. Ideally, we will have documents spun off of this that cover individual requirements in some rigor, and this document is mostly just to sort of keep track of things in a running fashion. Next slide. So PubSub, this is the place where we actually have made progress, and I think that it's a very good document. The I2RS requirements got folded into this document. This is in front of both NetMod and Netconf at this point, and really not going to say much more about it. Next slide, please. Ephemeral state is still our biggest problem. We basically have said that we need help with ephemeral. We have asked this at a couple IETFs. We've had people stand up and say, yes, we'll help with it, and the people got busy and seemed to not have a chance to help us out the last couple of months. So we're going to ask for that help again. The biggest problem that we have is that we need to know what to do, and the assumption that we were given from the last two IETFs is that people have ephemeral implementations. We're happy just to document what those are and try to move forward with those. So if you have an ephemeral implementation, you're willing to stand up and say what it does and how it actually mapped in NetMod and Netconf. That's exactly what we look for as something to start with.
I have a question.
Yes.
Who are those volunteers?
So I believe Andy volunteered to help. I believe Dan Bogdanovich volunteered to help. Martin offered his services as well. Not necessarily as a implementer of a specific ephemeral, if I recall. And Kent also offered help. So But again, these individuals all seem to be very busy, obviously, with your existing business. So this is somewhat understood. So we're going to try again. And a point that Martin had actually raised earlier while we were chatting is that part of the issue that the group has with us as I2RS is we're not clear about what those requirements actually mean. We have presented before in terms of here are some Venn diagrams of how things can interact, what the interactions mean in terms of possible implications upon the model. Andy has given us a lot of very good feedback, and so has Jürgen in terms of implications, what happens for each of those types of things, whether it's panes of class, tagged ephemeral, completely standalone data store. These things are all very complicated. The discussion that we just had about RESTconf being sort of a unified model without having a specific data store actually hit on some of those issues as well. So these are things that are making progress within Netconf itself. It's just a matter of how do we actually move forward on this specific set of issues. And this is where we need the most help the earliest. Next slide, please. Secondary identity. One of the requirements of the I2RS architecture is that we have the secondary identity that is passed around mostly for traceability requirements, where middle boxes or proxies or other types of entities are involved. So for example, I talk to some top-level provisioning system as identity Jeff, and it talks to the rest of the network as identity root or something like that. We would like that information to be conveyed that Jeff required this transaction and have that passed along as part of the protocol and potentially tagging into nodes that are installed into the system. The discussion that we had is that this potentially could be stored as metadata. So we have a way that it can go into the Yang, for example. How do we actually pass this information into the protocol? Open question. Next slide, please. I2RS also has IDEA priority in terms of clients have the ability to potentially preempt each other or to avoid being preempted. What this means is that we need to have some ability to take the state that we are installing into the system and having that priority reflected, and also how does that actually carry in the protocol as well. Next slide. Transactions. We have a variety of things that we're intending to do in terms of perform all or none, perform until error, performance storing errors. We had some amount of attempt at mapping these into operations in both Netconf and RESTconf. So RESTconf obviously can handle the perform all or none. In terms of the rest of them, exactly what could we do. And as we answer the question about ephemeral state, I suspect that will actually drive some of these as well. So for example, if we are forced into RESTconf because that is what makes sense for the application of ephemeral, for I2RS use cases that do require ephemeral, some of these options may not be implementable. These are things we need to know. So in terms of the future, what we're really looking for immediately, as much as possible, is please help us with the ephemeral state. Help us figure out what that means. We will continue picking apart the requirements from the sorted to-do list, and actually as they come out into various documents, they'll get removed from the to-do. The one sort of additional thing I would give towards ephemeral state is that there has been some commentary in other mailing lists of, for example, if I want to turn on tracing for a given piece of information, and I don't want that state to persist in the running store, that's a good thing. That actually crosses one of our use cases, potentially as tagged ephemeral. So we're starting to see ephemeral use cases come up in the context outside of I2RS. So I think that the wider IETF community, as we start doing more Yang type things, we'll get broader benefit from the set of features. We're just sort of the people that are trying to be the early adopters. I believe that is all my slides. Are there any questions and/or comments and/or Sue?
So one other plea for help. The reason that we've worked pretty hard to have a couple models for you to look at to go with it is maybe that'll help us do the ephemeral state. We're needing help. I think that's pretty...
Yeah, just to make it a bit more action-based, should we plan a joint conf call in a few weeks?
I think that would be wonderful.
Joint conference call in a few weeks, just to make it more binding and action-based?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, So it's
3
very
weeks
good
from
running.
now.
So let's discuss this after the session and find a date where such a conference call would be yeah, fitting for most of the chairs and key experts.
Benoit Claes. So I see that this is an individual document and that you want this to disappear, and that might be fine. But now, do you come here as the chair of ITRS telling this is what we need, or is this something which is in progress, right? If I compare with the PubSub, we got the PubSub requirement draft, and then, okay, this is stable, this is working document, I mean stable, no, at least this is working document, and we work on this. Now, this is like in between, so I'm slightly confused.
So the reason why it's in this particular, we would like this format, specifically, we would like ephemeral, is that we know from prior discussions that there are significant consequences to each of the choices we have on the table. We're at the point of, please tell us what is the, from perspective of the experts being Netconf, what is the best choice to implement ephemeral state? We have some of our use cases that we can actually do mappings to, but if we provide you just arbitrary requirements without understanding the consequences, we will not necessarily end up with a good document. So I'm not trying to provide a rigorous set of formalized requirements. I'm looking for help to not only help define that set of requirements, but also the likely solution.
Right, but you have, if I believe correctly, an ITRS requirement document, right?
We have an architecture document, yes.
Architecture, all right. So basically what you have in this draft are simply the requirements from the architecture translated here with some extra text. That's it?
Effectively, yes.
Okay, this is what I was missing. Because I was thinking it was like somehow a moving target of things that we might be needing in the future, etc.
The architecture says that we require ephemeral state.
Okay.
In terms of what that actually means, part of the problem with the architecture document originally is that since we were previously prohibited from doing data models, we couldn't even say, here's the example of what we would like to be ephemeral. Now as we start producing data models, we can refer to this document and say, here we go, this is how we would like to do this. Please suggest exactly what this look like with additions to the Yang and how it perform in Netconf.
Benoit, we'd rather have a conversation about this because no one has any, there's enough latitude in the decision on ephemeral state that we'd rather have a discussion with the experts and say, gee, let's talk about the trade-offs rather than send you a set of requirements.
It is much better for us to ask what is most permissible and what is best, rather than say, here's what we want, and then be told no many times until we eventually come to the same conclusion.
Hi, Eric Voigt. I don't see Anais here, but he was talking in NetMod earlier today about OpenConfig. I believe there's some implications to the ephemeral there, so if you're looking for people to ping who aren't in the room, I'd be happy to talk a bit. I know Alex is there, but ping Anais to see if he's interested.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Eric is next.
The traceability in the PubSub is still requirements. We just don't need help as much with that right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a
Be
time.
fast.
We have a time issue as always.
Be fast. All right, I promise I'll be fast because I'm really providing an update. Alex is going to provide the meat. He and I and one other guy Alberto been working on the requirements for PubSub. So next slide. Okay, I'm going to be presenting the requirements. Alex is going to be presenting the technical details. Where the requirements and technical details come from IETF 91, well, basically there was a number of subscription peer mount drafts. In the interim since then, we had a draft go to ITRS on PubSub, and that became a working group draft. That working group draft is intended to cover the needs of all the different working groups, not just ITRS. The different working group chairs got together and said, let's not just look at ITRS, let's try to capture all the requirements. Next slide. Now, just real context before I hand it off to Alex. Basically, what is PubSub and why is it important? Well, what we have on the left side today is really state-of-the-art. We have a polling system for getting Yang objects. There are other ways of getting Yang objects, one being a regular stream for periodic updates every so many seconds. You have on change where you only push objects every so often, and that is another way to get it so you're updating changes only. There's also hybrid models where you combine the two, where you send every so often if the object exists. Next slide. Now, the consumption models that we've seen looking over the different drafts are many. Many people want to use Yang objects. Many people are interested in the benefits of getting push updates rather than having to poll. This includes applications, controllers, peer network elements, and network management systems or orchestration. So there's many different models. There's also tiers of models where a network element might subscribe to one bit of information, run a process on it, and then send something up to a higher stream, to a higher level, higher abstraction. This is pretty important because many of the models that are not based on pub/sub cannot react quickly enough to change in the network state. So the idea that you're pushing a state change to another system, which then reacts and pushes another state up, is in some cases the only way to react quickly enough to some of the applications that are out there. Next slide. Now, as I mentioned, there are a whole bunch of requirements out there. Only a few of them come from R2RS. Just looking at a few of them from the netmod, you get to see ACLs, syslog, routing config, interface management. There's reasons to subscribe to all this information. If you get to look at the set of requirements which span these things, they get in topics such as filtering. How do you know when you need to filter? Is it going to be a stateful or stateless filter? Believe me, we want stateless filters, but there are some changes that require stateful filtering. Are we going to do that right away? Dampening. If there's a change, how long till you push the change if there's another change afterwards? Do you need some kind of bundling capability to have many updates bundled together to be sent off? And that's really what we're trying to do in the requirements draft, is list out the types of things that are needed in the subscription in order to provide the right information at the right pace. Next slide. And I'll end up with this one because it'll be a good way to hand off to Alex. Basically, the way to think of this pub/sub service is that you have a request coming in for either on-change notifications or periodic changes. You might need to ask for QoS parameters for the subscription, and that, the whole idea of how fast do you update things for like that. You might have to pass along filters. What do you care or not care about in the Yang subtree? And then there might be a period of negotiation where the system which is being subscribed to will tell what the system is willing to support, and therefore update the publisher so that it sends only objects interesting to the subscriber. So before I hand it off to Alex, again, these are general requirements. There's a lot more I didn't talk about in the draft, but anything before I pass it off to how one way could actually be made to happen. Fast enough?
Yeah, I have a question. What is the planned schedule for this draft? When will it be stable enough to go to LASCO?
I don't know. I mean, the working group draft only became 0.0 and 0.1 a month ago or 2 months ago, and so the actual date for closure is still to be determined. We've had comments from Benoit. I guess that's one of the things we're going to ask IETF this Friday, is to try to establish a schedule. It's still new enough where we have a determined close date.
Okay, the very first information I heard was that you guys are having a tough schedule and finalize soon. Is it true?
Sue is driving us towards getting drafts out in a very aggressive rate. I believe that the ITRS requirements are probably relatively stable. The thing that I would suggest is that this is a draft that, again, we think that much of the rest of IETF would find useful for other purposes, and we would ask you to get further review outside of ITRS context.
Okay.
Okay, hi. So I'm going to present on the second draft, which is basically essentially responding to the requirements, basically with the technical solutions. The first one is motivation. Eric just talked about this. So next slide, please.
So the solution is basically to provide a push-based mechanism as an alternative to the polling that is prevalent basically with Netconf. Again, it's a technical response to the other draft. Basically, what this draft this describes are essentially two aspects. One thing is basically it defines a subscription model which provides a set of subscription services with which a subscriber can basically subscribe to which updates and support they are interested in. And there are subscription negotiation facilities to essentially negotiate basically if the parameters and so forth are acceptable. And then it also provides facilities to also manage the subscriptions. The subscriptions themselves are complemented with also push mechanism and the transport. The solution that's proposed there leverages and builds on top of RFC 5277, so this is basically the Netconf notification draft. There are some parameter extensions that we're proposing. And one thing should also mention there's basically a capability defined in this RFC 5277 interleave support. Basically, we do require this capability here. And beyond this, there are other alternative transport mappings conceivable, but those are outside the scope here. Next slide, please. So in terms of the subscription primitives, the most fundamental one is the create subscription primitive. This basically builds on, or really actually is an extension of the create subscription, which is already in RFC 5277. The idea is basically that there's a special data stream that users can subscribe to. The data stream is called push update. It's basically conceptual, continuous and perpetual stream of data store updates. And on top of the stream, you can then basically specify your parameters, basically filters as to, for instance, if you're only interested in a certain subtree or in only certain nodes that meet certain criteria and so forth, that sort of thing. Also subscription policy, which basically tells if you want to have periodic updates along then with the frequency, or an on-change subscription policy if you're only interested in whenever things change, potentially also with the ability to specify a dampening period so that in case of fast-moving changes that you're not getting flooded with those items. Okay, so here's basically an example. Just for reference, I think we can, in the interest of time, let's go over this. In addition, there are some other subscription primitives. For one, there is the lead subscription. This is not part of RFC 5277. It's needed to tear down a subscription without having to tear down actually the Netconf session itself. Likewise, we're proposing to have a modified subscription, separate RPC for that with parameters analogous to the create subscription, only basically referring to a subscription that is already in effect. And again, the reason for that is because it's preferable to having a modify by first deleting and creating something which you might have run into certain race conditions and so forth. Next slide, please. So in terms of negotiation, subscription negotiation, when a subscription request is issued, the server or the publisher should have the ability to reject the submission if the request is unreasonable or could not be fulfilled. This could be, for instance, because there are implementation limitations. For instance, not every implementation may be able to support an on-change. Periodic is conceptually a little bit simpler to support. There might be resource limitation if you're subscribing to a high frequency and large volume of data and so forth. And so therefore, so basically, the server needs to have the ability to reject this, but also, as part of the response, include basically a set of parameter settings which would be acceptable and which would have succeeded, so that basically too much of an error and trial and error type of pattern is being avoided. In addition to this, there are also some additional notifications provided also in the draft, which basically indicate whenever the subscription promises essentially cannot be kept. For instance, if a subscription needs to be suspended, resumed, and so forth. Next, please. Okay, the push updates themselves leverage basically notifications. So basically, we do define a notification for that. As part of this notification, we include a subscription correlator, as well as basically the data store contents. Again, you have an example here. Next, please. So subscription management. So basically, these primitives and so forth are accompanied also with the Yang data model that reflects a subscription, which allows users to monitor essentially what subscriptions are currently in effect. there's an additional optional portion of the model which allows users to also configure additional data streams if needed. So if you don't want to have the standard data store push, but basically some custom stream, so that you don't just basically, in terms of analogies, so that you don't just control the nozzle, but that you can also control basically the faucet of the stream itself. Basically, this model allows you to do that. Next, please. So this basically provides just the Yang tree of the subscription data model, and here you see basically the subscriptions with the various parameters, the start and stop time, the various filters, the periodic versus the unchanged policy with the dampening and period intervals and so forth. Next one. Okay, this one basically specifies how the optional streams can be configured, again with the policy, when to push updates, with the filters, what to push and so forth. And next, this basically brings to the conclusion. So again, the URLs are there, and basically our goal is basically to seek the working group adoption. That's all. Thanks.
Concerning working group adoption, the situation right now is that we are not able to adopt new working group items right now. We would like to finish our current active working group items first. I think the criteria should be something like the 5 drafts which have been in last call are more or less closed, and zero-touch draft goes into last call. So if we reach such a state, we will think on adopting new working group items. I assume this will be somewhere near to Prague or after Prague meeting in the summer, I hope. So this will be probably the time where we can think on it. But let me ask a few questions to the people in the room to see the sense. Who actually read the PUB/SUB requirements draft? Please show hands. So this is the basis of the decision whether we are going to adopt this solution addressing the requirements in PUB/SUB requirements. And so people please read the PUB/SUB requirements draft and comment on that on Netconf mail list. So we would like to see whether you are agreeing with those requirements. The other question is how far does this draft address the requirements in PUB/SUB requirements, fully or partly? So this is a question to Alex.
Well, it basically addresses them. Well, it addresses them. It addresses them partly because it does not address the. It addresses them. Well, basically addresses them fully, but it does not provide the for the ability to. Well, it does not allow for alternative transport mapping. So basically, there's one specific transport mapping that is provided there. The requirements basically allow.
The reason why I'm asking is we need to understand whether there is something which needs still to be addressed. Mm-hmm. If not, why not? So just to clarify, I mean, whether there is something still to do additionally, or are you doing something which is sufficient? Anyway, so I don't want to discuss this further. This is a question we need to clarify. So the other question is, I would like to see the sense of the room concerning the support of the Netconf working group people on this draft. Who thinks this is something Netconf working group should address and work on? Please show hands. Who thinks this is something Netconf working group should not work on? Okay, so the support is there. Anyway, this question will be again asked on Netconf mail list. Physical meeting does not decide anything. We have to verify on the mail list. We will ask this question on the mail list again. But the interest is now only being noted. The same question will be asked in Prague again before adoption or at some point.
Makes sense.
Thanks. Let us use the remaining 5 minutes for one of the last two agenda items. As far as I know, the presenter of this draft VU Netconf multiple replies is here. Okay, so you have 5 minutes.
Okay, I go very quickly. Hello, my name is Bin Liu. This new draft is actually intended to merge some existing work. Next, please. The fragmentation requirement and solution, which has been discussed a couple of times in previous meeting, and also the persistent reply draft, which was discussed in Honolulu, and some relevant meaningless discussion. We believe that these different scenarios and issues might belong to a common problem space that in sometimes multiple replies might needed for a single request. And hopefully we can sort of unified solution for these different but similar requirements. Next, please. Okay, now the scenarios we have identified are the bulk reply, which means the reply are very big, that one single reply might not sufficient to carry all the content. So fragmentation might be needed. The other is the persistent. For example, if we launch a pin or tricert command, then there will be continuously replies for the single request. And and long time. We might need multiple reply to monitor the progress. And the last one is for open discussion. And we thought maybe potentially the data push could also belong to the same problem space at the messaging level. So the requirement for the Netconf, we need a mechanism to handle the multiple replies so that they could be correlated for a single request. And it should be able to terminate the response at any time. And should be able to cancel the request in pipeline scenario, that we don't need to wait for the pipelines to cancel the request. Next, please. Next, please. Sorry. Okay, next step, we need to complete the scenario collection and the requirement analysis. So we welcome contribution on this problem. And we already have some solutions written in the draft. So welcome you to read and comment. Okay, that's the slides. Thank you.
Okay, this has been presented last time, as far as I remember, and has been merged with another draft. Who actually read the current draft with the title or draft Leo Netconf multiple replies? Please show hands. Who read this? Those, I mean, this seems to be 5 or something. Those who read it, do you support the work in Netconf working group? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, okay. So, as I said earlier, for the draft CLEM, we cannot adopt right now anything. So we would like to ask the authors to go to the mail list to raise discussion and get support. And it will be most likely discussed again. But the support on the mail list is very important. Also, this is the case for the last agenda item, on time capability, please go to the mailers and raise a discussion and get support. Without such a support, it is not possible to adopt. Thank you. So this is the end of the session.
Blue sheets, please.
Okay, sounds good. On the program or, okay.
Talk about all these issues, but taking